25 seconds.
Status check.
Go Atlas. Go Centaur.
Go Starliner.
Go Starliner. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. The rise of Starliner and a new era in human spaceflight.
Clear the tower. Now 10 seconds into flight. Vehicle's begun the pitch over program. Body rate responses look good. Now 15 seconds in. PU's gone to closed loop control. RD-180 looks good at full thrust. Seeing good chamber pressure on both SRBs. Now 26 seconds into flight. RD-180 now throttling down to partial thrust as expected. Engine response looks good. Now 38 seconds in. RD-180 engine operating parameters continue to look good. Vehicle is now passing through max Q, maximum dynamic pressure. Chamber pressures on both SRBs continue to look good. RD-180 engine operating parameters also continue to look good. Now passing 1 minute into flight. And Mach 1, Atlas 5 is now supersonic. And vehicle now throttling up. Engine response looks good. Continue to see good chamber pressure on both SRBs. 1 minute, 20 seconds into flight. Body rate responses on the vehicle look good. 1 minute, 30 seconds in, standing by for SRB burnout. And we have burnout on both solid rocket boosters. Atlas will hold on to the SRBs for an additional 48 seconds prior to jettison. RD-180 has gone back up to full thrust as expected. Engine response looks good. 1 minute, 50 seconds in. Atlas is now 17 miles in altitude, 11.5 miles downrange distance, traveling at 2,300 miles per hour. Now passing 2 minutes into flight. RD-180 engine operating parameters continue to look good at full thrust. And at 2 minutes, 11 seconds into flight, the Atlas rocket now weighs just 1/2 of what it did at launch, burning propellant at a rate of 2,800 pounds per second. And we've seen good indication of jettison of both solid rocket boosters. Vehicle's gone to closed loop guidance. Now just under 2 minutes remaining in the booster phase of flight. 2 minutes, 35 seconds into flight. RD-180 continues to perform well. Engine's now throttling down slightly. Engine response looks good. And Atlas 5 is now traveling at over 5 times the speed of sound. Centaur reaction control system is now pressurizing to flight levels. System response looks good. Three minutes, 10 seconds into flight. Atlas 5 is now 38 miles in altitude, 80 miles downrange distance, traveling at 5,800 miles per hour. RD-180 engine operating parameters continue to look good. Now 1 minute remaining until engine cutoff. Body rate responses continue to look good throughout the booster phase of flight. And RD-180 is now throttling to maintain a constant 3.5 G acceleration limit. Engine responses will all look good. Three minutes, 55 seconds into flight. And Centaur's begun the boost phase chill down sequence. 20 seconds to BECO. RD-180 continuing to look good as it throttles to maintain that constant 3.5 G acceleration limit. Atlas PU has gone to open loop in preparation for BECO. And standing by for BECO. And we have BECO booster engine cutoff, standing by for stage separation. And we have good indication of stage separation. We have pre-start on the RL-10, standing by for ignition. We have ignition and full thrust on both RL-10 engines. Chamber pressures look good on both engines.
We have confirmation of ascent cover jettison on Starliner.
Aeroskirt jettison. And we have good indication of aeroskirt jettison. Centaur now resuming active attitude control after successful aeroskirt jettison. Chamber pressures on both RL-10 engines continue to look good.
This was a very critical piece of the mission here. Staging is always a very dynamic piece of flight.
Now passing 5 minutes, 30 seconds into flight. And the Centaur RCS system is beginning the initial thruster firings for system thermal conditioning. System response looks good.
Now once again, Centaur will continue burning for about another 5 minutes.
Now passing 6 minutes into flight. And Centaur is now 95 miles in altitude, 570 miles downrange distance, traveling at 12,000 miles an hour.
Those dual RL-10 engines continue to propel Starliner. They are making up for a little bit of the booster flying a flatter trajectory and at lower thrust, again, to maintain that 3.5 G forces. Again, a first flight for the dual-engine Centaur on an Atlas V. Starliner and Centaur continue to head to orbit.
Well, throughout this Centaur burn, chamber pressures have remained very stable. Just under 5 minutes now remaining in the burn. And Centaur is now 102 miles in altitude, 800 miles downrange distance, traveling at 12,700 miles per hour. And the Centaur propellant utilization system continuing with active control looks good. Body rate responses are all very close to null.
That means Atlas is flying almost exactly where it needs to be.
Periodic thruster firings as expected. Now passing 8 minutes into flight.
If you are just joining us, 8 minutes into Starliner's first flight. We've been through a successful booster stage separation. Centaur continues to propel Starliner. The next major milestone will be main engine cutoff at 11 minutes and 58 seconds.
Both Centaur RL-10 engines are continuing to perform well throughout the burn. Chamber pressures look good. And now coming up on 9 minutes into flight, Centaur is 101 miles in altitude, 1,200 miles downrange distance, traveling at 14,300 miles per hour.
Now the two control rooms you are looking at on the left, that is ULA's Denver Operations Control Center. They are a backup control room for the control room on the right, which is the actual Atlas Spaceflight Operations Center. They were the ones who launched the rocket about 9.5 minutes ago.
Now close to bottle temperatures.
As you can see, everyone is locked in on their screens monitoring data. You might have noticed there wasn't much excitement during launch, but ULA will be happy once we get to stage separation, which is coming up almost 15 minutes after launch, so about 5 minutes from now.
Centaur system performance remains nominal throughout this burn, continuing to see stable values on our fuel and oxidizer tank pressures, main vehicle battery temperatures and pressures, and continuing to see good pressures on our helium and hydrazine storage bottles. Telemetry quality has been good throughout this burn, only seeing very brief minor dropouts. Now approximately 1 minute remaining in the burn.
So once again, after Starliner separates from Centaur coming up in about 4 minutes, Starliner will circularize its orbit with an orbital insertion burn. Again, about 30 seconds to main engine cutoff.
Chamber pressures on both RL-10s continue to look good.
Now ahead of main engine cutoff, we are seeing good tank pressure on Starliner itself. Batteries are in a nominal temperature, good pressure sensor readings from Starliner as it prepares to free fly for the first time in orbit.
Standing by for main engine cutoff. And we have MECO, main engine cutoff. Body rate responses have remained very stable. Now passing 12 minutes into flight.
Now Starliner will stay attached to Centaur again until about 15 minutes. Expected to separate at 14 minutes and 58 seconds after liftoff. And that will be the first time Starliner free flies in orbit. And at that point, Richard Jones and his team in Houston will have full control over the vehicle. And they will set it up for an orbital insertion burn that will take place 16 minutes after separation.
Approximately 2 minutes now remaining until OFT capsule separation. Body rate responses continue to look very stable throughout this coast.
So you're looking at the Boeing Mission Control Center there. At this point, they have transitioned to a mission support room. The people you're seeing sitting on console designed, tested, and built Starliner. They are the experts on the systems. So if flight controllers need any help, they will be the ones answering the call.
Now passing 13 minutes, 30 seconds into flight.
Oh, in just over a minute, we're expecting to hear that Starliner has separated from the vehicle.
And about 1 minute now remaining until OFT separation. Body rates in the roll, pitch, and yaw direction, all very close to null. And about 30 seconds away from spacecraft set. Now standing by for spacecraft separation. And we have good indication of separation of the OFT capsule.
There it is. ULA has successfully completed their piece of the mission. Starliner is free flying for the first time in space. From here, the Johnson Space Center mission controllers will be flying Starliner. We will hear reports exclusively from there.
And Starliner's software has been switched to orbit mode, meaning the spacecraft is executing the commands it needs for operating in space following a successful launch into orbit, into the orbital trajectory. This is just one step flight controllers are taking in configuring Starliner now that it's flying on its own. Flight controllers are setting up for the orbital insertion burn, which will take place in about 15 minutes, a little over 15 minutes. And that'll circularize Starliner's orbit as it sets off to chase the International Space Station. The team here is also turning off several systems that were needed for powered flight but are not necessary now that Starliner is in orbit. While some are turned off, others will be turned on, such as the thruster housings that will be used to maneuver Starliner in space, and the solar arrays. The thrusters will steer Starliner through orbit, and the solar arrays will of course convert the sun's energy into electric energy to charge the spacecraft batteries.
The Centaur has intentionally left Starliner in an elliptical trajectory that would make it easy for the spacecraft and, more importantly, its future crews to come back to Earth at this point if there were a problem. But that means it's all on Starliner to make it the rest of the way into a stable orbit and on track for the space station docking. This is where Starliner's orbital maneuvering and attitude control engines come into play. Those 20 engines can provide each up to 1,400 pounds of thrust, which is more than enough to neatly heave Starliner that last little bit into orbit. They'll fire for about 40 seconds, setting Starliner on the right path not only for docking with the space station, but also a series of demonstrations that Starliner will perform before docking.
And those demonstrations will prove that Starliner is ready to safely dock with the space station. They actually began on the launch pad when we performed a check to make sure that Starliner's GPS and navigation systems agreed that it was indeed on the launch pad. After the upcoming orbital insertion burns, the demonstrations will continue so that ground controllers can ensure that the spacecraft systems are functioning correctly. When these first demos are complete, Starliner will resume its path to the International Space Station, and our systems here are telling us that these early steps are complete, and Starliner systems are doing exactly what they are supposed to do.
We still have a few minutes before that orbital insertion burn, about 13 minutes until it takes place. So let's go back to Florida, where Josh and Marie have watched a spectacular morning liftoff.
Brandy, it was a beautiful launch from here in Florida. It took off right here behind us. It is, the sun is starting to rise. There's a little bit of a rocket plume left over there behind us.
No rocket left back there, but it was just, it was stunning to see. I know you weren't looking from this view, you were looking much closer, but we just turned around in our seats to watch it here, and we could feel the rumble. And I know you didn't see people celebrating in the control rooms because, their job's not done at liftoff. It goes beyond that much further. And so people are, I think, now just beginning to breathe again. And so folks are just so happy about this accomplishment. Obviously this is just the beginning of the mission, but such a huge momentous occasion this morning.
And we're actually hearing that in the BMCC, Tori Pedrati is with Louis Atchison, who was Starliner's very first launch conductor and saw us through a successful first launch. Tori and Louis got to be feeling pretty good right now.
Yes, thank you, Josh. That is, it's really excellent to have Louis here and to have, take him away from console for just a minute to talk with us. So, Louis, I know that you and Chris Ferguson have been very close through this entire process, and I know that he asked you to create the launch procedures. Can you give us some details about that?
Sure. I think, as you all know, Chris has a very vested interest in how the launch procedures were put together. I started with the program probably about 7 years ago. About a year in, I was still a flight test engineer on the program. Happened to run into Chris in the elevator on the way to work one morning, and quite frankly, I didn't know he knew my name, but he said, "Hey, Lewis, if you got a little bit of spare time, can you work and maybe see if you can figure out how these launch procedures are going to work for the program?" And of course, I was like, "Oh yeah, sure, spare time. I can find time to gen up some launch procedures." So that began basically a 6-year journey on finding a unique way to integrate the United Launch Alliance Atlas V launch procedure, which is a tried and tested launch process, with something that had never flown before, our space capsule, and we're a lot different than any of the other payloads that they've flown. So as you can imagine, we had to merge several different cultures. Our flight control team, which is really homegrown from NASA, our ground control team, which is here at C3PF, that performs a lot of the spacecraft power-up activities.
And you're located here in C3PF, correct?
That's correct,
yeah.
right. I'm Florida local. So working through those processes, procedures, and finding a way to integrate all that. And oh, by the way, we have to find time to load a crew one day. And so taking that and marrying those things up so that everything comes together for an instantaneous launch window. So today, fortunately, we made our window. It's a first flight program. We saw some challenges over the evening, but we've got a world-class team here, and they were able to pull through the little things that we were seeing. Fortunately, we've had a good training program along the way. And it's just an incredibly exciting day.
I know, and seeing so far a successful flight has just been one of the best experiences I've had working on this program. But so you mentioned, we had a little bit of setbacks, some issues that we needed to work through. So I'm guessing today didn't go exactly according to plan.
No first flight ever does. So yeah, we were working a couple issues with the comm subsystem. Fortunately, the flight control team was able to work it out before we went to fly today. A few days ago, we had a couple issues with the hatch, which we were able to, which we learned about when we did our integrated day of launch test, which was actually a fantastic test. We did a couple of modifications to account for the fact that when there's pressure changes outside, we need to bleed a little bit of that pressure off so that we can get the hatch open. You'd be surprised how just a little pressure difference over a large surface area makes it really tough to open. So we were able to get that fixed so that the pad team here and the recovery team in the desert are going to be able to open that side hatch pretty seamlessly.
Oh, that's excellent. And there's nothing like a flight test to learn these things, right? So this is the reason why we test.
I completely agree. And this being the first launch that I've had the opportunity to work in a control center right next to the launch vehicle, we've simmed, we've trained for this, and there was nothing quite like the feeling of the monitors and the floor shaking after that rocket took off today. So it was an amazing electric atmosphere here this morning.
I completely agree. Is there anything that you'd like to share with the team, here in Florida, back in Houston? Anybody watching?
Sure. So first of all, I have to thank my family for all the time, patience, and effort that was put in over the past several years. We work a lot of long hours to make these kind of things happen, and I realize that they're at home watching, eagerly excited about the next part of the mission, which will be the recovery operation that I'm a part of. And also the team, right? This is one of the greatest team sports you could ever possibly imagine, and it takes a lot of people to make all this happen, and a lot of people need to be at the right place at the right time and know the right stuff in order to make this instantaneous launch window happen, and quite frankly, everything happen on this program.
Right. Well, thank you, Lewis. It's been great to have you here. Thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us.
Thank you.
Josh, Marie, back to you.
Thanks a lot, Tori.
Thanks so much, Tori. Well, before we go back to JSC as they're getting ready for the orbital insertion burn, I just want to, send a message out to everyone watching, not here from Florida. If you've never seen a rocket launch before, it's like nothing you've ever seen. I mean, it quite literally looks like another sun is rising up into the sky. So the next time we do this, there's going to be people on board. And if you're in the States, you can drive down here to Florida and come watch us fly.
Yes, just be prepared for a lot of traffic. Don't expect to be going anywhere anytime soon after launch, because we expect the place to be pretty jammed up, just like it was during the space shuttle days.
Yeah, I think there was upwards of 1 million people here. Now, this is actually some video that we got of the pad team right as they were closing up the white room, showing us their enthusiasm before they got off the pad. just taking a team moment to reflect on the history of this day.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and you don't always see it when we're doing these operational things, but the people behind the scenes, I mean, you saw them in that embrace there. It's really like a family. NASA, Boeing, ULA, we work side by side together every day. These people putting in these long hours, or they're doing this together. Everybody working towards a common goal, and you saw the culmination of that when we had that instantaneous liftoff on the first try.
Exactly, and like you said, it's very much like a family. A lot of these folks are going to be spending Christmas, making sure Starliner is doing well attached to the International Space Station. It just takes so much hard work and dedication to do what they do.
Yeah.
So.
And we want to go back over to Houston. We are standing by. Before too long, Starliner is going to be in orbit, so we want to get an update from Steve and Brandy to see how things are going over there. Hi, guys.
Thank you, folks. It is looking very good here in Houston. We are about 5.5 minutes away from the orbital insertion burn that's going to circularize the orbit of Starliner. Starliner is currently flying over Southeast Europe as it begins its chase. About 25 minutes ago, begun its chase of the International Space Station.
That's right. The International Space Station was about 260 miles over the Great Australian Bight, south of Western Australia, when Starliner launched today. And the crew members on board were sent up some video of their launch, so I know that they were probably following along and cheering with everybody here on the ground as well. They're looking forward to seeing Starliner dock to the space station tomorrow.
And it's going to take a little more than 24 hours for the Starliner to reach the International Space Station on this orbital flight test. The regular docking scenario will not take that long when there is a crew on board, but since this is the first flight of Starliner, want to make sure that all the systems are working, that everything's doing what it's supposed to. After all, Starliner is flying itself to this. So even though it's going Mach 25 right now, 17,500 miles an hour to catch up to the space station, still going to take a little time. Make sure all the systems are working the way they're supposed to. Make sure Starliner knows where it is, where it's going, and will reach it in time.
That's right. And we're now about 4 minutes away from that orbital insertion burn. The team here on the ground is following along, making sure that all the systems are hooking up and talking like they're supposed to as we do get closer to that. That'll be about a 40-second burn, and again moving the Starliner into the right orbit to catch up with space station.
And it's going to be the 4 OMAC engines that are on Starliner. They are orbital maneuvering and control engines, 1,500 pounds of thrust each. So combined, a 6,000-pound kick to push Starliner a little bit higher, a little bit faster, raise the orbit, and get everything together. Of course, those engines are going to play a big role throughout the next 24 hours as the Starliner makes its run at the International Space Station. And we are now about 3 minutes and 14 seconds away from the orbital insertion burn. This, of course, follows a terrific launch this morning and the power of the Atlas V, putting Starliner on the exact right course and speeding it from 0 to orbital velocity in just about 11.5 minutes, I think, of powered flight.
It's amazing how little time it takes to get to space.
So controllers here are looking carefully at all of their systems, making sure everything is good. It's very quiet here in the control room, which is always a good sign. That means the controllers are heads down, watching over the systems and keeping track of everything that's going on just above the Middle East now. We're also seeing here that Starliner's reaction control system engines, they are, for the fine adjustments, 100-pound class engines, are making small adjustments as Starliner adjusts its attitude moving above Earth.
Less than 2 minutes to go until that burn.
And you can see here the control room here in Houston, Starliner Mission Control. This is, of course, a flight control room that's been used before for NASA missions, but this is the inaugural Starliner mission, so it's the first time that it's been used for this Boeing spacecraft. And of course, controllers are used to this room and have spent a number of hours in here doing simulations and everything. It's a very professional crew, and many of these folks are veterans of the shuttle mission. Certainly Richard Jones, the flight director who is overseeing this ascent and entry team. And we are less than a minute away from the orbital insertion burn. Flight controllers here are not working any technical issues. The OMAC engines are getting positioned to make that 40-second firing that will circularize Starliner's orbit and get it into a position to continue its chase to the International Space Station, which is itself currently coming up on Central America. And controllers are maneuvering Starliner into the right attitude for this orbital insertion burn. Controllers watching the systems. And the orbital insertion burn has been delayed. Controllers are watching the attitude of Starliner as it positions itself and looking at the spacecraft in flight.
Once again, that orbital insertion burn that was supposed to take place about 5.5 minutes ago has been delayed as the team here on the ground is seeing Starliner not in the correct attitude for it. They're working through that, and we'll be looking for the next chance to get that done.
Currently, Starliner is using its 100-pound class thrusters to maneuver in space. We are 37 minutes into this first flight of Starliner. And flight controllers are seeing what the OMAC engines are, of course, 1,500-pound class thrusters. Each one of them, there's 4 of them on Starliner. That's what they'll use to complete the orbital insertion burn.
Team here in Starliner Mission Control still working through some steps to try and get Starliner in the right attitude for the orbital insertion burn. Working on the next opportunity for that, and looking to get Starliner in a good position for that.
And Flight Director Richard Jones reports that we are in a stable orbit. Starliner is in a stable orbit.
Once again, Starliner is now in a stable orbit. They've got it in a stable position, but the teams here on the ground are working through what the best next steps for Starliner should be.
And Richard Jones reports that his flight controllers are turning the Starliner spacecraft to the what we call a tail sun position. That means the solar rays will be pointing to the sun to recharge the batteries on Starliner, and of course to power the systems on the spacecraft. Starliner is in a stable orbit. And flight controllers are working through all the options at their disposal as this maneuver to put Starliner in a tail sun position takes place. Starliner's flight path and orbit are both stable. And we do have an off nominal insertion reported. We have spacecraft control. Guidance and control teams are assessing their next maneuvers. Spacecraft batteries are good, and the spacecraft is in a stable orbit.
View here inside Starliner Mission Control, where flight controllers are working through what the next steps for Starliner should be. You can see Flight Director Richard Jones standing up there beside the behind the Flight Director console, talking with his team members here in the room.
And once again, we have had an off-nominal insertion. We have spacecraft control, guidance, and control teams here at Starliner Mission Control are assessing options, assessing all their options, and contemplating the next maneuvers for the spacecraft. Starliner has good batteries and is in a stable orbit.
And the flight control team also reporting that Starliner did finish moving into that tail sun position that will allow its batteries to recharge.
And if you're just tuning in, Starliner lifted off from Cape Canaveral, Florida at 6:36 Central Time this morning. We have had a off nominal insertion, and mission control teams here at Starliner Mission Control are assessing all of their options for the Starliner spacecraft. It is in a stable orbit, it has power, and its solar array is facing the sun to recharge its batteries further.
That orbital insertion burn was scheduled to take place 31 minutes after launch, but didn't happen on schedule. Again, teams here on the ground are evaluating their various options, looking at what the best next steps for Starliner might be.
And once again, if you are just joining us, Starliner lifted off from Cape Canaveral, Florida this morning at 6:36 a.m. Central Time to begin its chase of the International Space Station. We have since experienced a off-nominal insertion, and the spacecraft has essentially is in a stable position. It's fully powered. Mission Control here in Houston is assessing all the options. We're going to step away from the broadcast, and you can stay updated on everything that is taking place with the Starliner mission on Boeing.com.
We'll also be getting you more information here on NASA TV as the morning progresses. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to sign off for now, but we'll have